3 years into the Russo-Ukrainian War, with Ukraine's death toll already exceeding 500,000, the country has finally erupted in its first major wartime protest against the government. What's baffling, however, is the reason for the protest. It wasn't triggered by the devastating loss of troops and territory on the front lines, nor by the fact that the war has shattered the normal lives of Ukrainian citizens, where ordinary people can be snatched off the streets and drafted at any moment. Instead, the outrage was sparked because President Zelensky moved to strip 2 anti-corruption agencies of their independence. To an outside observer, this is difficult to comprehend. Could government integrity truly be more important than national dignity and the very survival of its people? This question becomes even more pointed when one understands that these 2 so-called independent anti-corruption agencies are fundamentally incapable of curbing corruption. Their true purpose is to serve as a lever of control for the West to influence Ukraine. How did such an absurd situation become a reality in Ukraine? What is really going through the minds of the Ukrainians chanting slogans in the streets? In an interview with a reporter, one protester explained, if this bill passes, it will be even harder for Ukraine to join the EU. This statement, while seemingly naive, captures the sentiment of many Ukrainians. In their eyes, Ukraine's failure to join the EU isn't because Europe is unwilling to accept them for its own strategic reasons, but because Ukraine itself hasn't done enough. They have poured too many sunk costs into integrating with the West, and simply cannot accept the reality that the West may never truly see them as one of their own, that their long-held goal was just an illusion. So, when Zelensky pushed a bill through Parliament to strip these 2 independent anti-corruption agencies, whose personnel and operations are guided by the West, of their autonomy, their long-simmering anxiety and anger finally found a breaking point. For years, the official reason given by the EU and NATO for denying Ukraine membership has been its severe government corruption, which they claim does not align with the values of the democratic world. This is despite the fact that Western nations have their own, albeit more sophisticated methods of siphoning off public funds. But in this game, the West is the referee, and what they say goes. These 2 Western-supervised anti-corruption bodies were part of Ukraine's effort to appease the West. Although they did little to fix Ukraine's corruption, and in fact became another cog in its systemic corruption, they served Western interests well. The agencies allowed Western powers to profit from Ukraine while simultaneously monitoring the political leanings of its officials, ensuring the country would not pivot back toward Russia. Naturally, the West praised these institutions. Thus, in the eyes of many Ukrainians, these agencies became, in a sense, symbols of their hope for joining the West. Consequently, when Zelensky turned his knife on these so-called anti-corruption bodies, the pro-Western Ukrainian public panicked and grew resentful before the West itself had even reacted. This is despite the fact that Zelensky's move to centralize power and consolidate finances is an unavoidable necessity for Ukraine to maintain its footing on the battlefield, especially given its staggering losses and wavering Western support. Even Western governments have largely understood this and have not reacted strongly. But tacit approval from Western leaders doesn't mean the Western supervisors on the ground, who profit handsomely from these agencies, are willing to give up their lucrative posts. And it is precisely these lower-level personnel who control the channels of Western interference in Ukraine. So, at the instigation of these individuals, Ukrainians who see joining the West as their ultimate goal and who have come to view Western aid as their last lifeline since the war began, took to the streets to protest Zelensky's authoritarian actions. As for whether this serves the interests of Ukraine, or even their own, these protesters no longer have the capacity to think it through. Or perhaps, after round of cultural infiltration and re-education by the West, modern Ukrainians have lost the ability to think and judge for themselves. Back in the 1950s and 60s, after realizing that direct military confrontation with the Soviet Union was dangerous and futile, the West developed a new strategy: peaceful evolution. The goal was to use the West's economic superiority to lure socialist countries back onto the capitalist path. To achieve this, the West invested vast resources in media and propaganda, showcasing the achievements and lifestyle of Western society and promoting the ideals of freedom and human rights. In the 20th century, when information flowed slowly, the media was virtually the only way for ordinary people to learn about the distant world. Even if citizens of the Soviet Union and Eastern Bloc countries were wary of Western media, they were still unconsciously influenced by it. As the flaws of the Soviet model became apparent and economic stagnation set in, public discontent grew, making Western propaganda seem all the more appealing. Under these conditions, the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. Its constituent republics not only abandoned socialist ideology, but also yearned to join their former adversaries' camp. The peaceful evolution strategy had succeeded beyond the West's wildest dreams. Inspired by this success, the West refined the theory. In addition to media incitement and ideological infiltration, they began to intervene directly, helping opposition groups organize anti-government activities to topple regimes. They called these events color revolutions. These revolutions, carried out under the banner of democracy and freedom, had a single true purpose: to dismantle stable political orders that did not serve the West's interests. Ukraine and Russia, both Slavic nations with a shared history, have a natural affinity. This, however, does not suit the needs of the West, particularly the United States. The U.S. needs to shrink Russia's security space and stoke its security anxieties to disrupt Russo-European cooperation and maintain control over Europe. And so, under American manipulation, Ukraine's Orange Revolution erupted in 2004, overturning the original election results and installing the pro-American Viktor Yushchenko as president. Just as the U.S. had hoped, Yushchenko pursued a staunchly anti-Russian and pro-American agenda. But for Ukraine, whose economy was heavily dependent on Russia and whose population included a large pro-Russian contingent, this created a severe social crisis. In the 2010 presidential election, Viktor Yanukovych, the pro-Russian leader who had been defeated in the Orange Revolution, won again. Perhaps because the media had widely predicted a victory for the pro-Western Yulia Tymoshenko, the West was unprepared to interfere with the results. Although Tymoshenko refused to concede, the transfer of power went relatively smoothly. Under Yanukovych's leadership, Ukraine restored pragmatic cooperation with Russia, and the country's economy improved significantly. But by the end of 2013, another large-scale riot broke out. Although the West and various pro-Western figures called it a revolution of the Ukrainian people spontaneously rising up against a corrupt pro-Russian puppet regime, the direct involvement of then U.S. Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland and Senator John McCain, who personally visited Independence Square, made it clear that this was a coup supported, if not orchestrated, by the United States. It was precisely after this coup that Ukraine, under Western guidance, established the so-called independent anti-corruption agencies. Labeled as anti-corruption, their real function was to serve as tools for the West to join Ukraine's system of corruption, make a profit, and, on the side, monitor the political leanings of Ukrainian officials. After this, Ukraine's political scene became a monolithic block of pro-Western factions. The pro-Russian camp was left with no ground to stand on, and even homegrown nationalist factions were swept along. Current President Volodymyr Zelensky is a prime example.
This actor, who once performed in Moscow and advocated for a peaceful, negotiated settlement to the conflict, found himself completely unable to control the anti-Russian impulses of the Ukrainian bureaucratic machine after becoming president. He was forced, step by step, down an anti-Russian path.
But these pro-Western Ukrainians never seemed to consider what a dangerous choice it is for a country to deliberately provoke its powerful neighbor. Perhaps they believed that Russia would never dare to initiate a war, or that, if it did, the West would help Ukraine achieve victory. However, in the real world, international relations are governed by national interest and power. When Russia determined that Ukraine's attempts to join NATO threatened its national security and realized a peaceful solution was no longer possible, it decisively launched its special military operation. Ukraine, on its own, was of course no match for Russia and could only hope for Western support. Initially, the West did provide military equipment, nominal aid, and economic sanctions against Russia. The joke, however, was that due to severe deindustrialization, the combined military-industrial capacity of the West could not match Russia's. Economic sanctions, without the participation of the world's largest industrial power, China, had little effect on Russia, which is fundamentally a resource-exporting nation. Seeing that Russia wasn't collapsing as expected, but was instead getting stronger and richer as it shifted to a war footing, the West, fearing it wouldn't recoup its investment, grew stingy with its aid to Ukraine. By the second year of the war, as its population drained away through emigration and battlefield casualties, Ukraine's biggest problem became a severe manpower shortage. This was a topic the West wouldn't even touch, other than to pressure Ukraine to continuously expand its draft. Now, as Ukraine's war potential is nearly exhausted, the West, particularly the United States, has once again changed its anti-Russian tune and begun to engage with Russia, leaving a war-torn Ukraine twisting in the wind. The Ukrainian people, brainwashed time and again by the West and their own domestic pro-Western factions, find this reality hard to accept. But in truth, Western politicians had admitted from the very beginning of the war, openly in front of the media, that their goal was for Ukraine to fight to the last drop of blood to exhaust and weaken Russia as much as possible. The people who paid attention to this information either fled to Europe for refuge or defected to Russia. The ordinary citizens who remain in Ukraine today are either completely apolitical or have fully bought into the Western narrative. Given this context, it's no surprise that Zelensky's move against the Western-supervised anti-corruption agencies would trigger domestic turmoil. After all, the politically engaged citizens remaining in Ukraine today are precisely the ones who cannot accept such a decision.